Today we are diving into a geopolitical chess match that is just fascinating. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar trade war, and according to one narrative, it wasn't diffused by diplomats in some stuffy room. Nope, it was allegedly handled by a billionaire, a single phone call, and a whole lot of corn. So, how did that happen? Let's get into it.
So the whole story, at least according to this telling, kicks off with this, just one phone call. You know, a direct line between two of the most powerful leaders on the planet. And that single conversation supposedly set the stage for a complete 180 on a trade war that was just spiraling out of control.
And right in the middle of this whole thing, one billionaire. The crazy part of this story is that his own personal business crisis, something that should have been a huge liability, somehow became the secret key to unlocking this massive global standoff.
So, that's the big question, right? How on earth did a simple phone call and one tycoon's very big problem become the very tools that diffused a multi-billion-dollar trade war? Well, let's break down exactly how this narrative says it all went down.
Okay, so first up, the high-stakes trade war. You gotta picture this like the opening move in a chess game. The story begins with a pretty classic trade standoff, but believe me, the stakes were anything but ordinary. The US makes this really aggressive play against India, putting billions and billions of dollars in trade on the line. And that move, according to the source material, it was a crippling 50% tariff. I mean, just imagine that number, 50% slapped right onto certain Indian exports. This was no warning shot, folks. This was a direct hit aimed at a vital economic lifeline.
And the impact was, well, immediate and brutal. We're talking about an $85 billion export market that was suddenly in jeopardy. The source we're looking at claims that the affected exports just plummeted by 40%. Can you imagine? That sent absolute waves of panic through Indian businesses who really relied on that trade.
Okay, so here's where the plot really thickens. A totally separate issue, something that seemed to have nothing to do with tariffs, suddenly gets thrown into the mix. And at first glance, it looked like it was going to put India in an even weaker, more vulnerable position.
And that brings us to Mukesh Ambani. You've probably heard the name. As the head of the absolute giant that is Reliance Industries, he's not just India's richest man. The narrative we're following actually frames him as a kind of secret weapon for the government in global talks. But this secret weapon was about to get caught in a very serious trap.
So check out this domino effect that the story lays out. First, Reliance has this huge oil deal with a Russian company called Rosneft. Simple enough. Then, boom, the US slaps sanctions on Rosneft. And suddenly, just for being a customer, Ambani's company finds itself right in the crosshairs of US sanctions. Now, this wasn't just a problem for one company. This was a potential crisis for the entire Indian economy. It really looked like the perfect trap.
But this is the absolute pivot point of the whole story. It's about how this moment of, maximum weakness was supposedly flipped on its head and turned into a position of incredible strength. What looked for all the world like a checkmate was actually an opening for a brilliant countermove. And the logic, as the source presents it, was actually pretty simple, but really powerful. The idea is that Reliance is so massive, so intertwined with India's economy, we're talking everything from gas stations to groceries, that if it fails, the ripple effects would be catastrophic. And here's the kicker. A destabilized India, a key strategic partner for the US, is a huge problem for America too.
And this really shows you that strategic flip perfectly. See, on one hand, the US thought it had all the leverage, right? Threaten India's biggest company, get what you want. But the counterplay, the new leverage for India, was to frame it differently. To say, hey, if you sanction our biggest company, you're not just hurting us, you're hurting your own interests by destabilizing a key partner. Suddenly, the threat itself became the bargaining chip.
Which brings us to what this whole narrative calls the masterstroke of the deal. Think about it. They needed a solution that could solve the tariff problem, the sanctions problem, and the political problem all in one go. And the answer they landed on was, well, you're not going to guess it. Corn. So here's how this great corn bargain was supposedly put together. Over in the US, you've got farmers with a massive surplus of corn they can't sell, putting political pressure on the president. At the exact same time, India just so happens to move up its own national plan to blend more ethanol into its gasoline. So the pitch becomes incredibly elegant. You have a corn problem, we need corn for our new ethanol program, let's make a deal. And guess who is positioned to be the big buyer of all that corn and producer of the ethanol? Yep,
Reliance Industries.
And this is where the alleged quid pro quo just snaps into focus. It's a straight-up trade. The U.S. gets a massive new buyer for all that surplus corn, which is a huge political win. And what does India get? Well, that devastating 50% tariff gets slashed all the way down to 15%. Their $85 billion export market is protected, and their top industrialist gets to avoid those crippling sanctions. Everybody gets something they desperately need.
So when you look at it this way, if the narrative holds true, the final deal was this incredible piece of diplomatic jujitsu. It was designed so that every single major player could walk away, stand in front of their people, and declare a massive victory.
So for the U.S. president, it's a win-win-win. First, he gets to sell all that corn, which makes a key voting bloc, the farmers, very happy. Second, he can spin it as being tough on Russia, claiming he pressured India to reduce its oil dependency. And third, the tariff reduction isn't framed as backing down. Oh no, it's a reward for India's cooperation. It's a perfect story for the evening news. Meanwhile, for India's prime minister, the wins are just as huge. Those punishing tariffs get cut way down, which saves that massive $85 billion export market and all the jobs that go with it. And this is so important, it's all done without ever publicly looking like they bowed to pressure from the U.S. A huge domestic win.
And finally, let's not forget the billionaire at the heart of it all. What does he get? Well, his company completely sidesteps those devastating U.S. sanctions. He also secures a steady, cheap supply of U.S. corn for what's going to be a very profitable ethanol business. And maybe most importantly, his role as this essential economic and diplomatic bridge between countries is cemented, making him even more influential on the world stage.
Which really leaves us with a pretty provocative question, doesn't it? As the lines between big corporations and governments get blurrier and blurrier, is this what the new global playbook looks like? Are we entering an era where private tycoons are the real diplomats, brokering these huge deals behind the scenes? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this breakdown.